So this week we're going to discuss what we call American prophets. And prophets, we use the term both from a religious perspective, but also from a cultural perspective of figures who both understood the possibility of democracy, articulated a vision of democracy, recognized the gap between their vision of democracy and the realities in the United States. And there are a number of different prophets over the course of the semester. In fact, there's two more, since Henry Ford was seen as a kind of a prophet, and so was Huey Long by their advocates. Emerson, how many of you have not read any Emerson? It's good. How many of you have read Self-Reliance before? Some fewer than most. Emerson, as you know, is one of the nation's leading essayists, intellectuals. He was a household name by the 1840s. He led what was known as a transcendentalist movement, which really was a kind of spiritual movement to act on what Emerson believed one could commune with God and act on God's will. He had numerous friends. Thoreau was a close friend. Frederick Douglass became a friend. He started his career as a Unitarian minister. He, of course, you probably know, was a Harvard graduate. He left the ministry and devoted the rest of his life and never identified with a specific religious organization. And in fact, he identified himself to people when they asked what their faith was. He identified himself as a Quaker. He said he was more of a Quaker than anything else. Emerson said he believed in the Quaker's still small voice. That voice is Christ within us. And Quakerism, let me just explain Quakerism. It's a radical religious view that emerged during the English Civil Wars. They were, in a sense, perfectionists. They imagined a world, a post-millennial world in which it would resemble heaven. And there were diggers, ranters, and levelers who also believed, like Quakers, that the Spirit of God was within you and within all people. But the diggers, levelers, and ranters in England were essentially killed off because they refused to abide by the laws of the land. Quakers were unique in that they believed that the Spirit of Christ or the Spirit of God was within me and you and all humans. And thus one could access God's will and commune directly with God. It was, in a sense, the opposite of Puritanism. The central tenet of Puritanism is that one can never know God's will. One can never know God's will. Quakers in England, and then a number of them left for the United States. They tended to congregate in groups. They were seen almost as a kind of cult, and there's still a lot of Quaker communities in the United States, especially Pennsylvania. And as a colony, Pennsylvania was the Quaker community. But because the Spirit of God or Christ is within you and me and all humans, Quakers vigorously opposed any kind of physical violence. They opposed war. And in fact, in the United States, the Quakers sat out the French and Indian War. They refused to participate as soldiers in the American Revolution. War of 1812, they refused to participate. Significantly, in the Civil War, Quakers served at very high levels. They were all anti-slavery because they recognized that slavery depended upon violence. In fact, Quakers as a group were the first, blacks and Quakers were the first abolitionists. In fact, the very first anti-slavery petition in the United States was a petition of Quakers in Pennsylvania in 1688 with African Americans describing the violence of slavery, that it depends on violence, and thus there's a problem with it. In any event, Quakers were cult-like. Emerson did not have family members who were Quakers, but very much identified with them. And so remember that for Emerson and for Walt Whitman, which I'll get to, Whitman's mother was a Quaker. He also did not identify specifically as a Quaker, but he considered himself one more Quaker than anyone else. And it helps to appreciate Emerson and Whitman's writings. It's why I discuss this. Quakers refer to themselves as I said, the inner light of Christ is within you and me and all individuals. And this spiritual framework, I think, is central for understanding and explaining a lot of Emerson's writings, and especially in the sense of self-reliance. The central theme of self-reliance is reliance on the self, and because God, Christ is within you, you rely on the self, you rely on God. They're almost inseparable for Emerson. To be a good person, to be a righteous, good man or woman, by relying on the self, you're also relying on God. In fact, in self-reliance, he says, to believe in your own thought, to believe that which is true for you in your private heart is true for all men. That is genius, because you're tapping into the Spirit of God or Christ within you. Speak your latent convictions, and it shall be the universal sense. Envy is ignorance. Imitation is suicide, because you're repudiating the light of Christ that's within you. And it's also a central, everyone knows if they haven't read Emerson, that his kind of two-word motto is trust thyself. Trust thyself. And in trusting oneself, you're also trusting in God. Every heart vibrates to that iron string, he writes in Self-Reliance. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. This is a Quaker prophet speaking. Quakers themselves in their services, there was not a hierarchy. They repudiated hierarchies. And so both in the antebellum era and today, how many of you have ever been to a Quaker service? A couple of you. So you know that there's no minister there. You sit together, and if the Spirit of God awakens you share vocal ministry. That was also true for not all Quakers, but a number of, especially New England Quakers, in the antebellum period. Thus, trusting yourself is also reflected by trusting in God. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. Emerson also says in Self-Reliance, everywhere I am hindered of meeting God and my brother, because he has shut his own temple doors and recites fables merely of his brothers or of his brother's God. In other words, he's refusing to tap into the inner light within himself. Not surprisingly, Emerson was an abolitionist, a silent one for many years, but he finally, he was considered probably the preeminent orator with Frederick Douglass in the antebellum period, and this was the golden age of oratory. And almost all of Emerson's writings began as speeches, and then they were published. Douglass was actually considered a better orator than Emerson, but both were seen as extraordinary. And that's how they made money. You could make a lot of money. The best way to appreciate oratory, the golden age of oratory then, is that you compare it to a hip-hop concert or an NBA basketball game. Basically, people would travel for miles around to listen to good orators. So in the Lincoln-Stephen Douglas debates, in their debates in Illinois, people came from all over, not just in Illinois, to listen to their debates, to hear their debates, in the same way that people go to watch the NFL, travel from far away to go to NFL football games. So in 1844, Emerson, for the first time, spoke out against slavery and celebrated the British West Indian emancipation. England was one of the first major, the first powerful nation to abolish slavery, beginning in 1883. They passed they passed abolition in 1834. In his speech in Concord, Douglass sat on the stage beside Emerson. They were friends. Emerson never defined himself as an abolitionist. He really saw himself as an intellectual, as an intellectual, an orator, a writer. And he was, conservatives hated him. He was despised in the South. And in fact, from 1830 until 1860, many, if not most, of his writings are anti-slavery, but beginning in the late 1890s until 2010, Emerson's writings that invoke anti-slavery were dismissed as bad writing because of the way in which white Southerners gained control of the Civil War. So the essays that celebrate Emerson profoundly downplay or elusively refer to slavery. Not everyone liked Emerson at the time. I mean, he was truly a radical. He was a kind of revolutionary in his vision of democracy. His vision of democracy it was constrained in terms of gender. He was friends with a number of leading writers, although women at this time were denied a public voice. They were, in fact, Maria Stewart, who was an African American in Boston living on the North Slope of Beacon Hill, was the first woman to give a oration that we know of in the United States as an abolitionist. So women were prohibited from speaking, but they dominated the literary marketplace in books. Women were more successful in publishing novels in particular than men. And the best example is Harriet Beecher Stowe. John Quincy Adams, who was with his father, the only two presidents until the Civil War who never owned slaves. Quincy Adams was progressive, but not at all a radical. And in fact, he came to abhor Emerson, or what Emerson stood for. He abhorred a fashionable quest for whatever seemed new. And he singled out Emerson as a leading perpetrator of what he called the wild and visionary fantasies that had recently cropped up in New England in particular, and the North more generally. Here's what he said of Emerson. After failing in the everyday avocations of a Unitarian preacher and schoolmaster, Emerson starts a new doctrine of transcendentalism, declares all the old revelations superannuated and worn out, and announces the approach of new revelations and prophecies. Adams essentially specifically groups Emerson With leading abolitionists, he invokes William Lloyd Garrison. He says Emerson is just like William Lloyd Garrison, who was despised and hated and received numerous death threats from the time he starts publishing The Liberator until the Civil War. And Adams grouped Emerson with William Lloyd Garrison, as I said, and also phrenology. Phrenology at this time was a hugely popular pseudoscience that connected the shape of your head and the bumps on it to your personality. And it was seen as a science, as a form of medicine. You could identify the personality by how your head is shaped. And of course, John Quincy Adams thought that was outrageous. He also, I saw Emerson as a kind of French revolutionary. In fact, he likened Emerson to Jean-Paul Marat. And he said that they were ingredients in the bubbling cauldron of religion and politics, reflecting that he recognized Emerson's revolutionary writings, understood that that was deeply dangerous in this fragile republic. From early on, there had been efforts of Southerners to walk out of the Union, and Emerson and Quincy Adams wanted to keep it together. He was seen as a profound, he saw Emerson as a threatening to this new democracy of the United States. Any questions or observations from reading Self-Reliance that any of you would like to share? None? Okay. Do you have anything, Roberta?
Well, I think I'd like to ask you how you see the relation of the protagonist of Self-Reliance, the self-reliant self,
Yes.
to Bartleby. Or are you going to come to that?
Yes,
later?
I'm going to come to that. I'm going to come to that. That's a great question. That's a great question. But I have to summarize Bartleby first. Okay, Whitman. How many of you have never read Whitman before? Hopefully none. Whitman was, as I said, a Quaker on his mother's side. He embraced, like Emerson, this vision of what they called sacred self-sovereignty, in which the kingdom of God is not someplace above or beyond, but within you and within all people. God was immanent or indwelling, allowing people to overcome the burden of original sin and to reposition the fundamental locus of value in spiritual passions and emotions rather than in worldly authority and social conventions. And one of the things I want to frame is, here's Whitman. Did I bring it? I have not the original copy of Whitman's 1855 Leaves of Grass, but a very beautiful 20th century made exact copy of 1855 Leaves of Grass that I will bring to share with you next week. So today, Whitman was arguably one of, if not the greatest American poets. He was, and poetry at the time was hugely popular and was also an aspect of politics. Virtually everyone who was literate, especially in the North, would write poetry. There were poetry clubs. There were families often met other families for a poetry evening. Poetry was published in newspaper columns. Poetry was seen as the art form, the literary form that was the most powerful, that cut to the core of what one wanted to convey. Percy Shelley, who has been the husband of, or was the husband of Mary Shelley, and who Mary Shelley was more famous than her husband, highlighted the poetry was also politics. Shelley famously said the poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, and that's something that Whitman saw himself as being as a poet, a kind of legislator, an authority. And why is that? Because poets achieve harmony, unity, order through language. Hence the significance of form and meter. And for Whitman, for poets at this time, virtually all poets, and for most Americans, they understood that language stemmed from, was created and produced by the imagination. When expressed through poetry, language enables us to apprehend a higher beauty and truth. In other words, the form of the poem shapes its meaning and content. And poetry required imagination. And Americans then, that goes back to Aristotle, saw that imagination, or believed imagination, was unique to humans, what distinguished humans from every other animal was the capacity to imagine a better place, a different world, and to seek to realize it. Frederick Douglass said imagination was the peculiar possession and glory of humans, a sublime, prophetic, all-creative power. It could be used to articulate a new world free from slavery. So only humans possessed imagination. And Whitman, from the time he was a teenager, really loved poetry. He was a journalist. He wrote for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. He published poetry in newspapers. His first published poems were anti-slavery poems. The Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, which was really profoundly divided the nation, galvanized him. And his poetry he emphasized throughout his poetry this message of equality. And more than just about any other male figure, Whitman saw women fully equal to men. In his poetry, blacks fully equal to whites. But in his actual life, he did not define himself as an abolitionist. This vision was a poetic vision. He understood democracy. The central ringbolt of democracy is equality. He self-published Leaves of Grass on July 4th in 1855. He saw himself as a kind of embodiment of the birth of the nation, and he sees himself, July 4th is like he's articulating this vision, this new vision of radical equality for a new nation. And the first edition of Leaves of Grass, there's no titles. You read it as one long poem. And within all of these poems, he's embracing the democratic spirit of the democratic nature of poetry. And so in his preface in 1855, he writes, "The United States themselves are the greatest poem." This nation is the greatest poem. He sees that as a compliment to the nation. And why is it the greatest poem? Because poetry is about harmony, unity, democracy, inclusiveness, connectedness. And that's the ideal he saw for the nation. The bard is to be commensurate with the people. The bard isn't higher than, better than the people. They are commensurate. Of all mankind, the great poet is the equable man. The great poet is an equal to every other person. He is the equalizer of his age and land, as Whitman says. The messages of the great poets to each man and woman are, "Come to us on equal terms. Only then can you understand it." in today's terms, Whitman is an activist poet in his advocacy for all rights for all. He was also a shameless self-promoter. Whitman, after Emerson writes this glowing letter, private letter to Whitman, celebrating what he loved about the first edition of Leaves of Grass, Whitman immediately publishes a second edition, puts Emerson's letter on it without asking Emerson, and then also publishes Emerson's glowing tribute without asking Emerson, publishes it in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. And here's Emerson's endorsement. He says, "I find Leaves of Grass the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. I greet you at the beginning of a great career, which yet must have had a long foreground somewhere for such a start." And Whitman grew up, essentially in today's terms, working class. His parents didn't have a lot of money, but he loved writing from a young age, and you didn't need formal education to be a newspaper writer. Here is Whitman in 1855. So Leaves of Grass, his book, I want to just explain, give one reason for how he understands Leaves of Grass. Leaves meant, for journalists in particular, pages. It also, it was a common word for a title, a leaf. It also reflected nature. In the largest sense, leaves suggested God in nature. Grass was printer's slang for casual compositions that a compositor might set in type during downtime in his shop. So these casual compositions come from the soul, come from the heart, and they become pages. So in a sense, Leaves of Grass is this heartfelt book. He uses a lot, and in fact the poem that you read for today, there's a number of enigmatic lines or symbols that he wants. Some of them were common at the time, but some he wants readers to spend time with it. So for example, he refers to Canuck, which is Canadian, Tuckahoe, which is a farmer, Cuff was a kind of outlaw. In the largest sense, Whitman understood Leaves of Grass meaning sacred equality. We are all light-hued and dark-hued everyday people, blades of grass, nothing more, nothing less. In a sense, Leaves of Grass suggests the idea of democracy. We are, each of us, individual leaves, but from a distance, there's this beautiful unity. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. And that's why, especially in his first edition, there's no titles of poems. You just read the whole thing. Each poem is discrete, but out of many, one, which is his large vision of what democracy means. And so the title reflects this radical vision of democracy, the efforts to break down hierarchies, binaries, accepted rules. So throughout his poetry, Whitman tries to collapse the long-held distinctions or binaries between body and soul, flesh and spirit. I mean, Puritans, the flesh was horrible, the spirit was totally different. These were opposites. Black and white, male and female, polite language and slang, poetry versus prose, literature versus pedestrian talk. He wanted to conflate, he wanted to explode these binaries. In a larger sense, Whitman's poetry articulates this vision in a sense, of this new dispensation and new age of radical democracy that he hopes the nation will read deeply, and that will engender this revolutionary change in the United States in which the nation can fulfill the true vision of democracy. But Whitman's New Age depends upon poetic form, the poetic form of unity, harmony, connectedness, and empathy. For Whitman, poetry itself creates the condition of a true democracy. Poetry engenders democracy. So it should not surprise you that he self-publishes Leaves of Grass on July 4th of 1855. One of the myths of Whitman in the 20th century is that he was not well known in his time, that he had only cult status at the end of his life, that he didn't become a major poet until the 20th century. That's actually not true. He was popular in the 1850s. He had a small but very almost cult-like following among poets. And then and now if you're a poet, you identify yourself as a poet. There are a number of figures who recognized him, who identified with Whitman in terms of his vision of democracy. Emerson, in the tribute that Whitman then publishes in the newspaper in an immediate second edition, he says, "I am not blind to the worth of the wonderful gift of Leaves of Grass. I find it the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed." Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, loved Whitman and quoted Whitman to Lincoln on numerous occasions. Lincoln read Whitman in Lincoln and Herndon's law office in Springfield, Illinois. There was a big table with books on it for people waiting to see one of the two lawyers. And Leaves of Grass was often on the top, which people read as they waited to see Lincoln, who advised them on legal issues. Henry David Thoreau was so taken with Whitman that in 1856 he made a pilgrimage to Whitman's home in Brooklyn, New York, and said that Whitman was, quote, apparently the greatest Democrat the world, small d Democrat, the world has ever seen. And in a sense, the radical egalitarian vision of Leaves of Grass, I think, that's an accurate assessment. African Americans also embraced Whitman's poetry as their own. One of the leading African American newspapers or magazines is called the Anglo-African Magazine in 1859, includes Whitman's poem or lines from it, "I Sing the Body Electric," in that paper. Another just random woman who discovered Leaves of Grass was a woman by the name of Susan Garnett Smith, who was from Hartford, Connecticut. She probably read Whitman's third 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass, which expands greatly on the 1855 edition and included titles. And Whitman's first edition had a lot of ellipses, which I and other scholars suggest that the ellipses suggest that we as readers enter into the text and revise it as a way to better appreciate it. This third edition included Whitman's poems such as I Sing the Body Electric, Song of Myself, Boston Ballad. This woman, Susan Garnett Smith, was so taken with Whitman that she wrote him a letter after reading Leaves of Grass. And let me read that letter to you just to convey how influential and powerful Whitman's poetry was at that time. She doesn't start with "Dear Mr. Whitman." She starts by saying, "Know, Walt Whitman, that I am a woman. I am not beautiful, but I love you. I am 32 years old. I am one of the workers of the world. A friend carelessly lends me my leaves of grass for a day. Stealing an hour from labor, I take it out for a walk. I do not know what I carry in my arms pressed close to my side and bosom. I feel a strange new sympathy, mysterious, delicious thrill. What means it? It is the loving contact of an affinite soul blending harmoniously with mine. I begin to know Walt Whitman. I have not yet seen him. I feel that I must be alone. I turn my steps to Zion's Mill, a cemetery. The sun shines, the air is clear and fine. The birds trill songs, love songs, songs of praise for the boon of existence, or chirrup amorously to each other. They do not hesitate to tell their love. Why should I? I seat myself under a tree and muse a moment. A lovely panorama is before me. Hartford and the surrounding country. Hartford looked a lot better then than it does now. I hear no human voice, see no human form, but somebody whispers, "Open your book." The book opens itself. What do I behold? Oh, blessed eyes, I see the image of the great beloved soul, which has already embraced and encompassed me. Blessed be thy father and thy mother and the hour of thy conception. Oh, rich is America in her noble, manly, fearless son. Know, Walt Whitman, that thou hast a child for me. A noble, beautiful, perfect man-child. I charge you, my love, not to give it to another woman. The world demands it. It is not for you and me is our child, but for the world. My womb is clean and pure. It is ready for thy child, my love. Angels guard the vestibule until thou comest to deposit our and the world's precious treasure. Then, oh, how tenderly, oh, how lovingly will I cherish and guard it, our love, our child, my love. Thine the pleasure, my love, mine the sweet burden and pain, mine to have the stinging rebuke, the shame. I am willing. My motives are pure and holy. Our boy, my love, do you not already love him? He must be begotten on a mountaintop in the open air, not in lust, not in mere gratification of sensual passion, but in holy, ennobling, pure, strong, deep, glorious, passionate, broad, universal love. I charge you to prepare my love. I love you, come, come, write. Susan Garnett Smith. So, how do you interpret that letter? And how do you think Whitman responded? So this is an actual letter Whitman received. Yes.
Fan mail.
Pardon?
Just like fan mail.
Fan mail? So do you think she was serious?
I think she was definitely serious. I think she definitely loved him in like a fan type way. But also she was just very
Wait a second.
I've read that letter before and I just feel like every time I hear it, it just gets more just like a fangirl.
It gets what?
It's more like a fangirl of like a
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. So it is a fangirl letter. But usually, like fangirl letters, they're not serious.
Yeah, no, she's serious.
Yeah, she. Any other thoughts? So, how do you think Whitman responded? Yes.
I mean, the reaction, the letter is it's talking about this sort of physical baby that's being created. It's saying, have my child, but it's also talking about this like idea that Whitman has brought about in this woman's mind. So
Yes.
that we have the opportunity, maybe not you, Walt Whitman, physically, but these ideas that you've written about in this text have allowed us to create this baby, this sort of, not out of lust or out of my love for you, but out of this sort of sensual love for this universal freedom that you bring about in me. And so my womb is clean for the ideas that you represent.
Yes.
And the future that, a baby, it's this type of like rebirth.
Yes, that's very good. That's very good. And that there's something holy about sensuality. That one shouldn't be embarrassed about sex or sexuality or sensuality. It's holy. It's natural. It's holy. It's part of, it's inextricable from God's presence in everyone's own body and soul. Is there another? Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of, you shared with us the quote about like poetry is politics.
Yes.
And I was just thinking that at that time, poetry also, I mean, not just at that time, in today's times as well, is sort of like a vessel or a landscape for the erotic, a safe space with which to play with these ideas.
Yes.
And have them be accessible across like space and time and
Yes.
gender.
Yes, that's very good. And especially poetry, because one of the things that distinguishes poetry from narrative is that it almost requires the reader to participate in the poem and to interpret the poem. And in ways that narratives do not encourage nearly as much. That's very good. That's very good. Any other thoughts? So Whitman, unfortunately, did not respond in these two excellent answers. He put the letter back in the envelope, and on the envelope, he put a question mark, and then he wrote insane asylum, and then he wrote another question mark. Why? Why do you think he did that? There are a couple answers that I've suggested. One was Whitman was gay and he wasn't interested in women. Even though it Leaves of Grass, he loves both men and women. They both are fully equal. But he never dated a woman. The best we know, from today's perspective, he was gay. Two, and this is also in terms of, two is that Whitman always separated poetry from life, poetry from his life. So his poetry was truly revolutionary. He himself was not a revolutionary. He himself was much more cautious, much more subdued. In a sense, Whitman, as a living, breathing human being, was unwilling to act on his radical vision, both whether it's an abolitionism or gender equality or the poetic vision in general. And in fact, at one point, he said to his friend Horace Trebell, be radical, be not too damned radical. In other words, hey, okay, I realize I'm radical in my poetry, we need to offset that. And in fact, Trebell then he prompted Whitman and saying, that Susan Garnett Smith, he said, sounds like somebody who's taking you at your word. You should have been the last man in the world to write insane on that letter. You might as well write insane across Song of Myself, which in a sense is an accurate statement. And Whitman acknowledged as much. And so in a sense, the reason I narrate this story is that, I mean, Whitman, for many of his lovers who read him deeply, he was truly a prophet who envisioned this new dispensation, this new world of democracy, of a democratic nation that would be realized. And there's actually, if anyone is interested, there's I think a brilliant book that focuses on this particular theme. It's by Michael Robertson. It's called Worshipping Walt Whitman's Disciples. And Whitman was a kind of prophet for almost all of his readers because of the vision that he articulates through his poetry. Other prophets around the same period were Joseph Smith. All of you know Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. Mary Baker Eddy, who founded Christian Science. William Miller, the founder of Millerism. All of these figures believe that God or Christ or the Spirit is eminent and indwelling and of this world, which will make the ability to realize a democracy much easier. In a sense, I mean, the spiritual for Whitman and these other prophets is reflected or manifested in the material. And so this central theme is one of equality, democracy defined by radical equality, connectedness. And Whitman's song for occupations. Let me just, hold on, where did it go? Here it is. Did I not bring it with me? Hold on. I brought a copy of Song for Occupations, I think. I forgot. I forgot my copy of Song for Occupation. But the second stanza, he emphasizes the radical equality between men and women. Throughout the Song for Occupations, it's about an artisanal ideal of all workers receiving the fruits of their own labor, of this radical egalitarian vision of between men and women, and in fact, in the poem that you read, it's a work poem. A lot of it's manual labor, but women are every bit as present and as equal in it as men. That poem is another example of Whitman's vision of this radical democracy. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I was curious in reading Song for Occupation what Whitman's relationship with socialism or the Communist Manifesto was.
That's a great question. What was Whitman's relationship with socialism or communism? He never identifies himself as a socialist or as a communist. He always identifies himself as a Democrat. And so what he wanted to do was to invest this term democracy to mean something radically different than it meant at the time. He always saw himself as a Democrat.
So the institutional presupposition is not explicit.
No.
Because if in a country that has organized itself as a democracy, there are certain institutions.
Yes.
The obvious question is,
Yes.
do those institutions represent this democratic idea or not? Or does the democratic idea require some institutional transformation?
So for Whitman, no, for Whitman, Whitman was not, he was political, but he was not a politician, such that he did not offer any visions or.
Well, I understand that he may not have, for that reason.
Right.
He was the business of a poet.
Right.
With a rhapsodic orientation to reality rather than a programmatic one.
Right, exactly.
But there's still the question of whether this democratic rhapsody was meant to be oppositional, antagonistic to the established arrangements or not.
No,
And
because,
that was a question
yes.
that couldn't be avoided.
Right, so Whitman in a sense he was a prophet, a minister. So he believed that his vision there would be a conversion experience among the politicians to change the structure of the United States so that it would match or meet Whitman's vision. That's the best way to summarize it. He was himself, he was political. He acted on this radical vision himself at times. In fact, he was when he was in Boston in 1860, going through the proofs of the third edition of Leaves of Grass, and it was right when. It was exactly the time in which John Brown and his small army of blacks and whites raided the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in the hopes of taking over that arsenal and created a massive slave revolution or rebellion that would lead to, and somehow in Brown's vision, the end of slavery. And there were five African Americans who participated in the raid. A disproportionately large number of white raiders were from the Boston area. And several of them escaped and were not executed. And in fact, one came to the publishing office where Whitman was. And Whitman escorted him to the train station, gave him money for a train to escape to Canada. So he's acting, I mean, he would have been arrested had he found out. But he essentially supported revolutionary means to destroy slavery, even though he never defined himself personally as an abolitionist. So that's, it was another example of him of acting out this vision of democracy, but he recognized he was not a politician, and he hoped that his Leaves of Grass would lead to, in a sense, a conversion experience among politicians and among those who did not yet advocate or believe in the full equality of men and women, blacks and whites, all people. If that would be the best answer.
And it is therefore not said whether this equality has implications for the property regime or for the employment contract or for the conditions under which.
That's correct. So Whitman.
The higher forms of free labor.
That's right.
Self-employment and cooperation.
That's right. Because Whitman.
Would prevail.
Right. The higher forms of free labor. Very much the higher forms of free labor. He imagined, I mean, he was blind, I mean, even then, to the very early industrialization with the railroads. And so his vision was always this artisanal vision of independent entrepreneurs, artisans, creating through their work and their focus a healthy and fulfilling life for themselves.
So we could ask the question this way, because after all, the program here is, what was the message of these American prophets?
Right.
And in what respect did they converge in this message? So in speaking about Emerson,
Yes.
it seemed that you emphasized participation in the central experience of spiritual intensity, divine intensity.
Yes, divine
Which
intensity.
on one side is divinity,
Right.
and on the other side is vitality.
Yes.
And then when speaking of Whitman, what you're emphasizing is equality in participation.
Yes, but also,
But it's equality with respect to that good, the good of vitality or divinity, which is to be shared.
yes.
The democratic
Yes.
orientation just follows from that.
Yes, that's exactly right. So in a sense, Emerson and Whitman are there. You flip the relationship from Emerson to Whitman. Yes, that's exactly right.
So I would want to take that as a point of departure for a critical argument. But let me wait to see what you're going to say about Bartleby.
So Bartleby, how many of you have read Bartleby before? Most of you. I'm curious, just so I don't want to give you my relationship, but how, in terms of this articulation of democracy, where do you see Bartleby fitting in? What structure is the structure or the structure that by which we can understand democracy present in Bartleby?
A more immediate question for the reader of these texts is, what's the relation between the protagonist of Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, and Bartleby? Is Bartleby an example of self-reliance, or is he an example of the opposite?
No, so Emerson and Whitman, as narrators, as voices, they're writing both of them as preachers in a very different way. They are preachers, they're ministers seeking to achieve this radical transformation in all readers. And the narrator of Bartleby, who is, and actually his name in the very first edition, when the story was published in the Piazza Tales, he had a name, Mr. Cutlets. And then when it was republished, Melville chose not to include the name. So it's just an I narrator in the Piazza Tales, and for most editions today, it's an I narrator, and we don't even know his name. But what we do know about him is that he is a man of wealth. He prides himself for knowing John Jacob Astor, so he is a true elite. And there,
Lawyer for whom Bartleby is working.
yes, for whom Bartleby is working. And there are other figures in the office as well. There's the Turkey Nippers and Ginger Nut. So it's a small law firm. Turkey Nippers and Ginger Nut work for the lawyer.
They're presented as caricatures in a kind of Dickensian spirit, right? They're perverted in some way. They're like victims. They have adopted a stylized defense against this system that they're in, right?
I wouldn't go so far. I wouldn't go so far to say that. So each Turkey, Nippers, and Ginger Nut. Ginger Nut is just, he's a 12-year-old apprentice. I mean, you know, he feels comfortable being there. And there's a brilliant, I think, distinction between Turkey and Nippers in that Turkey, he's a very good worker in the morning. In the afternoon, he gets really upset and nervous. He also drinks too much wine. And Nippers, in the afternoon, is a perfect worker, whereas Turkey is a kind of perfect worker in the morning, and then in the morning, Nippers comes into the office in a foul mood. He gets his work done, but there's this wonderful binary between Turkey and Nippers, that one is especially efficient and productive in the morning, the other in the afternoon, which the lawyer, the owner of the shop, loves. And it's all about, essentially before the age of copying machines, just writing out multiple copies of these legal decisions and these legal papers.
These are details, right? I mean, the basic thing is that these characters around the lawyer have found some set of repetitious compulsions or neuroses,
Yes.
which are their way of adapting to the situation. So they're not fully human the way they're portrayed in the essay. Bartleby is fully human. Bartleby's obduracy.
I wouldn't say that. I think that they're very human. They're all too human.
All too human. Downsized.
Yes,
As
they're
found
all
in
too human.
This formulaic way of responding to the situation.
So, I mean, Bartleby is the more formulaic way by responding. I prefer not to. Whereas
That's literally formulaic, but the message is not formulaic. The message is the message of resistance, of no.
yes, I mean it's more explicit resistance. Whereas for Turkey and Nippers, they resist verbally, but not in their actions. They resist.
So what's behind all of this, connecting us to Emerson, is on the narrowest interpretation, right?
Yes.
Of Emerson,
Yes.
the Emerson that goes in the direction of Nietzsche.
Right.
What's the good? The good is, on one side, vitality, on the other side, divinity, the divine spirit. And how is it manifest, the possession of this good? It's manifest through the exercise of agency.
Yes.
Doing
yes,
something,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So Emerson's philosophy is a super philosophy of agency. That's the way in which he would prefigure Nietzsche.
Yes.
But Bartleby is the complete rejection of agency, is he not? Or is this obduracy itself a form of agency?
The
ambiguity in
Yes.
this prophetic method, in this kind of anti-prophecy of Melville.
Yeah, there is a kind of, I wouldn't call it an anti-prophecy. I mean, so there's a long tradition of calling the story an anti-prophecy. I would refer to Bartleby as highlighting both the benefits and the downside of this economic and this economic form of work in a small shop. In a sense, Bartleby is similar to a father-son relationship. That there is a hierarchy in a way that for Emerson and Whitman explode all hierarchies. Everyone is fully equal. And for...
Not really, I mean, that's literally Emerson, but from the standpoint of this idea of agency, right? This Napoleonic idea.
But for Emerson and Whitman, I would argue, especially Whitman, but even for Emerson, there is this possibility of having full and equal agency, through the power of language and literature.
You know, I think that the real meaning of this story is made clearer in the work of a 20th century poet, Samuel Beckett. The rejection of external
Yeah.
reality. And I'm thinking of
Beckett is, he's
Beckett's,
so,
I'm thinking of Beckett's first play, a forgotten play called
yes.
Eleutheria. This is a beautiful Greek word for freedom, Eleutheria, in which the protagonist of the play refuses everything in the same way that,
Yes.
and it's the refusal of external reality. So in this philosophy, which is close to the center of the American culture, the American consciousness in the 19th century, there's this idea that what is the object? The object is to take possession of life through this participation in divine transcendence. On one side, it's divinity. On the other side, it's vitality.
Right.
But this can be achieved only through a radicalization of agency. And
Yes,
the
yes,
individual
yes,
is
yes.
superactive.
Yes,
and
so
hyperactive.
that's,
like the creative God himself.
that's right,
Not like the God who suffers and dies, right?
correct.
And this superactive agent, this ego, creates around himself all the time disasters. And all these little characters, like the ones you mentioned, the three people who work in the office,
Yes.
are sort of part of the victims. They're collateral damage.
Yeah, they are, but so it's a different, both social political framework. The Office in New York, in a sense, I read it by Melville borrowing from a paternalist tradition that the workers in the office are like children. And that's the traditional form of the artisanal northern work ethic, is that your children, you teach your children, you put your children to work at a young age, and they then can become their own shop owners or small lawyers. Melville's writing in the 1850s, and not all states required lawyers to, I mean, the vast majority of lawyers, in fact, most states, if most states required a bar exam, but you just read a couple books for the law, you studied for the bar. If you passed the bar exam, you were a lawyer. And some states were more rigorous than others in the 19th century. But the Turkey and Nippers, they show no interest in becoming, establishing their own law office. And there's no explanation for it. But that's part of the problem. One of the problems of this artisan or petty bourgeois.
There's no way to do it. There's no way to keep ascending. So they've adopted these strategies which have resulted in their transformation into these Dickensian characters.
Yes, but at this time, unlike England, the United States, the industrialization was at its infancy, and the vast majority of Northerners, they started out as apprentices. I mean, essentially, Turkey and Nippers are apprentices to this lawyer. And in numerous law firms, the apprentices become lawyers themselves. They go out, they train with the lawyer, then they go out and become lawyers. And that's, I mean, Lincoln does that. Lincoln trains with a lawyer, he goes on and becomes a lawyer himself. He doesn't go to law school. Most apprentices don't. In this story, this highlights the downside of the apprenticeship model, meaning that the apprenticeship model is like a father-son or parent-child relationship. And if you don't like the parent, or you're a rebellious child, you're stuck. And the apprenticeship model only works if you learn through your apprenticeship and are able to become your own independent entrepreneur like the lawyer is himself.
I think this reading that you're giving it may be a little too narrowly political, because the fact is that the lawyer is doing what they do now, right? The Harvard law students go into these corporate law offices.
Yes, yes.
Think it's going to be very fancy, they'll get paid a lot of money, they'll have
Yes.
interesting work. Most of them have a miserable experience, so they're doing mechanical doc review or something, and they're stopping short of being reduced to this
Right,
condition.
but they're, right,
Minor personages in the
But they're-
Bartleby story. But the deep sense in which one could read the Bartleby novella as an anti-prophecy is that there's this rhapsodic, euphoric prophecy in Whitman and in Emerson
yes,
of this democracy.
yes,
And here's the anti-prophecy saying, this is the reality. There are all these victims, there's all this collateral damage. And the novella ends, Bartleby, humanity, a lament
yes,
for the victims of this super agency, of this philosophy of super activism and agency.
yes. That,
So it's a complication in the message. right?
yes, it is but that's also, I mean, my point is that I don't deny that, but it's also a complication in the whole structure of the artisanal petty bourgeois.
Of course, that would require a revolution. Yeah.
Exactly.
We
That's,
spoke about that in an earlier
yes,
class.
yes,
So,
yes,
so
yes.
what now is the majority, now, today, in the contemporary societies, what is the popular majority?
It is,
And throughout not just in the
Right,
United
right.
States, throughout the world.
right,
The popular majority in most of the large countries in the world is made of people who are poor and disorganized,
yes,
but their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois.
that's right, that's
So
right.
they aspire, what do they want? They want a small plot of land, a
Right.
shop, a little trade,
Right,
for which they can receive a fee or something. So their horizon of aspiration is turned to the archaic idea of isolated.
that's
family
exactly right,
business,
that's right, that's right.
Which is not a solution.
That's
So-
right.
So it's an illusion. It's also not a collective solution for the country. It doesn't signal the direction of any dynamic of inclusive productivity.
Completely
It
agree
could
with you.
Result in a growth miracle.
Completely agree with you.
So it's a labyrinth from which they cannot escape.
That's right. The difference is that in
And
Bartleby,
then Melville's anti-message would be justified as a lament on that situation until there were some kind of breakthrough.
yes, but Melville's lament, the vast majority of artisan or of workers like the workers in Bartleby's law office do achieve this ideal of becoming an independent entrepreneur or artisan. The vast majority in the North did. Today, you're absolutely right. They don't. Now they can't.
Yes.
Melville, in his very constricted story about this law office, does not offer a solution. I mean, it's also a time in which Melville himself was becoming deeply depressed. I mean, he hoped that Moby Dick would be an absolute world-famous novel, and it was a flop when it came out largely. He was struggling, but he does highlight the problem. In a sense, it's a problem of paternalism, a kind of paternalism. You study with this master. And if,
Well, I think the model of isolated archaic family business is not a solution for the future.
no,
But that's what the majority of humanity is now turned to.
that's exactly
for
right.
the lack of other solutions.
That's
right?
exactly right.
And so there would have to be, in each of these countries, a dissident elite, a counter elite,
Right.
that would take power, and in order to garner popular support, approach that popular majority
Right.
and offer it an alternative to the formula of isolated archaic family business.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
And that's not a poetical solution or a prophetic solution. That's a real solution in the world.
Yes,
a different
that's
kind of
exactly right.
state.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, Melville is always, I mean, especially in Bartleby, he's pointing out the downside of this structure in the United States. He's pointing out the downside of the petty bourgeois and the artisanal form of economy and political philosophy, really, in the North.
So maybe this would be a good place for me to take you up on the content of this prophecy. right?
Okay.
Starting from just the point where we're at. So
Okay.
what is the message? What is the good that the individual in Whitman or in Emerson should achieve? The good is possession of life.
Possession of life and the ability
Possession
to,
of life, which is at the same time connection with the divine.
the connection of the divine, possession of life. And possession of life, I would refine that by saying that the ability to receive the fruits of one's own labor.
And so it's an ideal of autonomy.
It's an idea of autonomy,
It's an ideal of
exactly.
autonomy.
And it's in
And
Whitman's,
it's
yes.
sharpest and most controversial when the ideal of autonomy also becomes an ideal of the enhancement of agency.
Yes.
That was
agencies.
the point that goes in the direction of Nietzsche and so forth.
Yes,
So the individual manifests his possession of himself.
yes,
He comes into the possession of life
yes,
in the present moment.
yes,
Because all we have is the present.
That's
We don't
exactly
live
right.
in the past or in the future.
right,
And he affirms this transcendence, right?
yes,
And all the attributes of vitality, which are first excess over structure, right? The structure doesn't dominate him in
right,
Emerson,
right.
Second, spontaneity. He's not controlled by the past. He's not like a machine in which the past determines the formula of what he does. You know?
No, but
Therefore, he's able to cause surprise.
Yes.
Surprise, right?
but he's, the past, he's in one sense inspired by the past. He uses the past to, as a.
Yes, but the emphasis is on breaking the past. I mean,
That's exactly right.
And he, as a result, he has a power. The power is the power to make the new, which is a central theme in Emerson, right?
Yes. Yes, it's to make the, to continually evolve, and then that continual evolution, there is newness. Yes.
To make the new.
Yes.
The perpetual creation of the new.
Would Emerson,
You're resisting my formula. I'm
Yeah.
taking these prophets at their word.
no, but does Emerson or Whitman articulate, I mean, yes, it's,
This is the euphoric, rhapsodic element of the story, right? Which Melville
he's,
the
yes,
counterside
he is,
to it.
it's the counterside too.
melancholic
Yeah,
downswing.
but so new in terms of their respective visions of democracy, but if they realize those respective visions, are they going to want to achieve more newness? I mean, Emerson remains essentially an orator and writer in his entire life.
I'm not expecting them to be programmatic thinkers.
Okay.
But what I want to do is to take this prophetic message
Yeah.
coming into the possession of life,
Right.
transcendence, and suggest what its frailties are, right? Because not to take the prophetic message on its own terms as the prophet saw it, but show where the problem is.
Right,
So,
right, right, right.
And so let's step back.
Okay.
So first of all, is this a philosophy or a theory? No, it's not.
Right.
It's not, but one could say there's a larger set of ideas which are conducive to this, an attitude to the world, a vision of the world.
Right,
that
right.
has certain elements. So
Right.
first of all, the world is what it is rather than something else, right?
Right.
It's not just an allegory. They're not just multiple worlds or multiple universes. The most important thing about the universe is that it is what it is and not something else. The solidity, the reality of the world is one presupposition. The second presupposition is time is real. Time is not an illusion. Everything is in time.
Yes.
There's nothing outside of time. Everything that exists changes sooner or later and is no less real for changing. That's the second tenet.
Right.
The third tenet is history is open. There's no script that determines what can happen forever, right? The third is the new, we were talking about the
Right.
making of the new is possible.
Right.
And the world is open to the creation of the new.
Right.
The fourth tenet is the individual self has unfathomable depth. And because it's deep, the self, it is obscure to other selves and even to itself. And the sixth tenet is the common, the demotic, has more promise than the noble, right? The hierarchical cultures had these canonical hierarchies of value,
Right.
and the Americans want to reverse that and say the popular has more promise than the noble.
Yes. Yes.
It's the rejection
Yes.
of the prejudice of the aristocratic culture.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So those are the presuppositions. And now what are the problems? First of all, let's take the idea of autonomy. This is an ethic of self-fashioning and of agency.
Yes. Right. That's right.
It's an uncomplicated idea of autonomy, not sensitive to the contradictions. So what are these contradictions? To be free, I have to be connected to others.
Uh-huh.
Every connection threatens me. Every connection is a threat of
I
something.
think I wouldn't say every connection threatens me. Is that because the whole concept of friendship, which is antithetical to the feeling of being threatened.
No, of course. So, Jean-Paul Sartre said, hell are the others. It's not that. So, to develop the self, we have to connect to others.
Right.
Every connection contains a danger, right?
Yes.
Of loss of personal distinction, of subjugation. So, what is it to be free? To be free is to connect without loss of self, without subjugation.
Right.
That's freedom. That's one dimension of freedom. But it's a dimension that's organized around attention. I have to connect. I'm not free if I'm isolated. I'm only free if I'm connected to others. But every connection at the same time places my autonomy in jeopardy. Like Emerson says, imitation is suicide. So there's this idea that the company of others, the society,
Right.
it brings freedom, but also brings the danger of subjugation.
Yes, although, I mean, Emerson also recognized the virtues of borrowing from others by then making it one's own. Yeah.
So then second dimension, to be free, I have to engage in a particular world, because no one can be free alone in the forest. I have to be engaged in a particular social world.
Yes,
But every society demands as the price of engagement surrender. So somehow to be free, I have to be able to engage without surrendering. Otherwise, I'm not free. And this is, I think, essential to Emerson. If I have to pay to society the tribute of submission, of imitation, as a condition of my engagement, I'm not free. I have to engage.
Yeah, but Emerson would not have said that he is not free if he mimics others. It's not, he
He
recognizes.
would not be himself.
He would not be,
possessed of
that's
himself.
correct, but he wouldn't say he wasn't free. I mean, there are layers.
He would say that is not self-reliance.
No, it's not self-reliance, but self-reliance for Emerson is one particular form of freedom, exactly.
Yeah.
And there are multiple forms, and so part of what he wants to do is to inspire people who are free but are frustrated,
Yes.
and to be able to achieve this, and
Now
to
comes,
realize.
I think, a more complicated dimension and more complicated for Emerson. To be free, I have to develop a habitual way of operating in the world. Which the Greeks call a character, right?
Yeah.
It's a character's destiny. But I'm not free if that habitual way of operating in the world then becomes an icon, a monument, that sucks the life out of me. So to be free, I have to form this habitual way of acting, but I have to be capable at the same time of disrupting it. Otherwise, I'm not free. So I'm just pointing out a series of contradictions in this idea of freedom, so rather than just this rhapsodic external, this wonderful agency, you begin to see that in all the crucial dimensions, it's composed of a series of contradictions. And if we are to progress in the exercise of self-fashioning, we have to somehow engage these contradictions and master them. If these theorists of autonomy don't have a vision of that or a solution to that, their idea of autonomy is shallow.
They recognize, so that, yeah, so my argument with you is that I think the binaries that you're articulating are much more severe than existed in, by Whitman, by Emerson, by Melville. Yes, there were these binaries, but they did not,
I think that just is a definition of freedom. So freedom is the ability to connect without being subjugated. Freedom is the ability to engage without surrendering. Freedom is the ability to develop a habitual way of acting in the world without allowing it to become you. So that it can't suck the life out. That's what it means to be free. That is, the only realistic idea of autonomy is a complicated and contradictory idea.
yeah, but they were all of them, this notion of autonomy, I mean, they all very much embrace the significance, I mean, as I said, of friendship, of relationship.
Of course.
And autonomy,
Of course.
autonomy presupposes an
Connection.
isolado.
No.
Okay,
It shouldn't.
okay,
It shouldn't.
okay. Then if you want to define
Because-
that, okay.
Because that would be an example of a perversion. Right?
Okay, okay.
A rich,
Okay,
realistic idea of autonomy presupposes connection.
right.
Connection
Right.
brings danger. So there has to be, I'm simply saying that they can't have an uncomplicated and uncontradictory idea of autonomy for it to be realistic. Now, why am I doing this? Because the point is not to deconstruct their idea, The point is to reconstruct it. So I'm saying that if we're to take this ethic of self-fashioning seriously, we have to purge it of its most obvious defects so that it emerges on the other side with a response to these problems.
Okay.
So now the second issue is there is a tendency in this ethic, in this philosophy of agency, which becomes manifest in Nietzsche, but I think it's...
But I think Nietzsche's the wrong, because Nietzsche lived in a world that was totally different from the United States.
I understand. Well, yes and no. I mean, the world changes and it doesn't change. But there is in this philosophy, and it's, I think, in some of Emerson's work, like his work on great men, on representative men, and so
Yes.
forth, there's this Prometheanism. That's a second problem. Now, I'm calling this Prometheanism. Prometheanism is this idea that in the presence of death, right, we're going to die. We experience this frailty. We beat the drums in the presence of death. It's like we crowd out our groundlessness, our mortality, through an affirmation of power. It's an ethic of heroic defiance and agency.
Okay.
That's Prometheanism.
Yes.
Now, that's what I'm calling Prometheanism, but it's actually not like the Prometheanism of the Greeks, because in Greek mythology, Prometheus stole fire to give it to humanity.
Right.
And these Prometheans steal fire to give it to themselves. So it's a different kind of Prometheus.
See, I don't think, I think if you asked Emerson or Whitman or Melville that question, they would not say that they were redefining the Promethean vision. Most of them, the central ideal from them was much simpler in one sense, and that is that they were able to receive the fruits of their own labor, and they truly were in love with their labor. And
well, you're bringing it back again to the early 19th century political economy and artisanal idea.
yes,
But what I'm trying to focus on in this little polemic about Prometheanism is the idea that you have in the West, in these thinkers like, say, Pascal.
right,
that in order to break the spell of routine, which is, after all, what so preoccupies Emerson,
right,
that we'll go through life like kind of sleepwalking, these tropisms. To break that spell, we have to terrorize ourselves. The individual has to subject himself to an argument ad terroir, in which he awakens from his slumber, from his routines, focusing on his mortality, on his groundlessness, and so forth, in order to seize the moment and come into the possession of life in the present, which is, after all, what Emerson wants.
yes. Emerson wants people to be fulfilled and to realize, to find work that is fulfilling. To find labor that's fulfilling. There is much more of, I think, there's a religious and philosophical aspect, but it's grounded in more of in a sense of, the understanding of the economy in which they lived, and Melville was.
But the problem is not understanding what existed. The problem is having a view of how it should be transformed. Those liberals and proto-socialists of the 19th century were unable to preserve the artisanal economy.
Yes, but they
because they had no formula.
But they also, no one had predicted it. In fact, one of the characteristics of the Civil War at the end is, especially in the North, they were so many Northerners regardless of whether you were an intellectual or not, they were absolutely bowled over by the revolutionary transformation that had occurred
Of production of technology.
went from an artisanal to a,
Exactly. So
they had a,
they had no way, they had no formula for reconciling, for example, independent economic agency or property.
that's exactly right.
With the relentless imperative of economies of scale.
That's right, that's
That
right.
would require reinvention of the property.
That's
regime,
right.
And they had no idea.
No, that's exactly right. So I mean, in their world, they imagined this society in the North continuing. They had no idea that there would be a revolution in all different
Yes.
forms. I
Yes.
mean, their revolutions were to achieve greater equality for everyone, greater democracy for everyone, and arguably,
Under what institutional arrangements is the question of the market order, of the democracy and so forth?
most of them, it was the market order, but the market order did not, for them, really impinge upon or interfere with their larger visions. None of them were, you know.
They didn't have a larger vision that was adequate, because if the dominant political vision was, despite all this talk about democracy and the common people and so
Right.
forth, what really was established in the constitutional arrangements of the United States was a kind of proto-democratic liberalism.
Yes.
It wasn't a radicalized democracy. And the market order was not an order which provided alternatives for the decentralized allocation of claims on productive resources, innovation in the property regime,
Right.
necessary to reconcile economic decentralization with economies of scale and scope.
Right.
They didn't do that. So simply to suggest that, and this has been a third defect of this philosophy of agency or autonomy, it has no clear or adequate political horizon. What is its political horizon?
For Emerson and Whitman, the political horizon, as I mentioned, was to expand their understanding of democracy. They recognized the flaws, but that was their framework.
Not good enough, is what I would say. So that they would have had to rethink the organization of the market and the organization of democracy.
The market was not it was not a major issue. The main,
It should have been.
but I mean, that's looking at it from the perspective of the present. I mean,
Yes, of course.
had there been no civil war, for the next 40 years in the North, there could have remained without also no civil war, no massive immigration. The political economy could have remained basically the same for the next 50 years,
I understand.
which would mean that
And now I think we come to the final problem, which is that this idea of autonomy or self-fashioning is empty. That is, you say, I want to be autonomous from society, from influence. and I
but
want to control my life."
they didn't say that. I mean,
No, they didn't say that. What did they say?
whether they emphasized community. They emphasized community. I mean, Emerson less so, but he's been criticized for that. But Whitman is all about a community, of creating a community. Melville also is very much about creating the whaling ship. He celebrates the whaling ship as this vibrant, almost as a vibrant community.
So then there would have to be the economic and political institutions which would give substance to that communitarian idea.
Exactly, and so for Melville, he recognized on a whaling ship that the political institutions it was monarchical rather than democratic. And he highlights that very much in Moby Dick.
Now, there's another set of problems that I just wanted to bring up before we end, which is not about autonomy. These are all problems that have to do with the theory of agency or autonomy or self-fashioning, right? Which is one dimension of these.
But for I would say that for these prophets, for Whitman, for Melville, we haven't gotten to Lincoln, also for Lincoln and for Emerson, the idea of self-fashioning it reflects finding work that you enjoy, that you like, and working hard and pursuing that.
And the idea was self-employment.
And the idea,
combined with cooperation.
that's exactly right.
Those were supposed to be the higher forms of free labor. Which,
Yes.
Whereas wage labor was denounced as a defective form.
Right, but there,
Retaining characteristics
exactly, but
of slavery.
that's right. But until the 1850s, the percentage of wage labor in the United States
Small.
was tiny. It was not seen as a threat at all, even for people who went to Europe and witnessed the oppressive wage labor. They imagined, and because of the size, for all kinds of reasons, they did not see the radical transformation coming that came with the Civil War.
Yes.
So it was not present. It was not a oppression, fear that one needed to overcome or to create an alternative to it or for it. Finding something that you loved as a form of work that can fulfill you both monetarily and religiously and in all kinds of ways was the idea. I mean, that's a basic artisanal ideal. And the one downside is that for all of the figures and in the artisanal society, you learn from what was then called a master craftsperson, whether it was your father or whether it was a friend or another family member. You learn from someone else how to become very effective at your craft, whether it was writing or speaking and there was a lot of collaboration. I mean, and people would offer suggestions and tips to other workers, whatever the profession was. So there was a real community among newspapermen, among farmers, they all had a close-knit community that they shared ideas from to improve their work.
Yes.
And they were proud of it.
Yes.
And so in a sense it was, I mean, to use a crude analogy, it would have been similar to athletes on a team together. They're sharing ideas for how you can improve yourself. And you pursue it because of both a love of what you're doing and the benefits from it.
Yes, so this brings me, your comment just now, brings me to this other question in the form of consciousness about sociability.
Right.
Which I would bring under the heading of coldness.
Of coldness?
Coldness, yes, I'll explain what I mean. So, in the history of modern social theory, the two classic problems are the problem of subjugation or domination,
Right.
and the problem of disunion or union. How society can become functionally differentiated, but still be unified.
Uh-huh.
What is the practical basis for social cohesion? There is a third problem, which the social theorists do not discuss in modern social theory, except obliquely, which is this problem of coldness. And to explain what I mean, let me recall the image that Schopenhauer gives of the situation of humanity, which is a description of modern society. So, in the cold night, the porcupines come closer together to warm one another. And then they prick each other with their spines. And then they move further apart and are restlessly going back and forth, closer and further, until they settle, Schopenhauer says, into an uncomfortable middle distance. This is the circumstance of humanity in the modern societies, in the contemporary society, this middle distance.
Right.
A characteristic expression of the middle distance as an attitude of sociability is something that has been very characteristic of sociability in the United States, which is what you could call a cheerful impersonal friendliness in the relations of people to one another. That's the middle distance.
Right.
Now, you contrast the middle distance to the circumstance that existed in the hierarchical, oppressive societies of the past, like the slave society that
Right.
existed in the south of the United States.
Right.
We said the ideology of the slave society was we're one big happy family, right?
Yeah, for the master.
For the masters, that was the ideology
Yes.
of the ruling class,
Yes.
right?
Yes, but it was based on a old feudal vision of a rigorous.
It has many forms in world history. Feudal society was
Right.
one of those forms.
Right.
But we could interpret it in the following way. And we're going to come to this next week in the discussion of Brazil. and
Right.
Brazil.
Right.
The characteristic social relation combines three elements. An element of exchange, an element of domination or inequality,
Uh-huh.
and an element of affect. So it's an unequal exchange that is sentimentalized. It becomes the vehicle of allegiance or affect.
Right.
This was the formula, the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. And the cheerful impersonal friendliness, the middle distance, emerges as the alternative, the only alternative to the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. Now, we might not want that. We might say, how can we become free without becoming cold? That is, these modern societies, in the process of being emancipated from oppressive structures, have become cold. They've settled into this middle distance. And the question is, how can we be emancipated without being subject to this coldness? Where does the affect come from? So, according to this ancient formula, the affect comes from an emanation of the warmth of family life, projected into the larger social sphere. So you treat your slaves as if they were part of your family, supposedly.
Right.
Huh? What's the alternative to that? And I'm asking as a question. And it seems to me that there's no answer to that question. But an answer might be that the alternative is the imagination. That is, the affect does not
Yes.
come from the emanation of family life. It comes from the creation of the new. And that's a different way of warming up social life. So if the political institutions allow for the creation of alternatives, and the economic institutions are also about the creation of the new, then this would be a different way of warming it up. This is an absent theme in the discussion of the message of the American prophets.
Yes, I mean, and part of the reason, and part of why I was pushing back against
So
some
I
of.
think the Americans don't debate this, right? This is not a subject of debate in the United States. But this cheerful and personal friendliness to every foreigner is a striking characteristic of the sociability of the Americans.
Yes, but I mean, yeah. So also, I mean, going back to this to what you've said, I mean, one of the things that distinguishes Whitman and Emerson from Melville is, as I've mentioned, I think that you haven't mentioned the role of religious faith and how that functions, because for Whitman and
I
Emerson,
started with it because I said the good that one is supposed to participate in autonomy, is on one side vitality, but on the other side it's divinity.
but the nature of their faith is that they were both, in a sense, they were Quaker-like. God and Christ
God
are
is inside
within
of
you.
or you are inside of God, right? That's the American religion.
Yes, yes.
That's the essence of the religions that the Americans created, as opposed to the religions.
That's
that they
exactly
brought to
right. So
Europe.
because of that, they were able to pursue, to trust themselves, as Emerson said, trust thyself, meaning tap into the spirit within you and with others, and in pursuing this work, you will be satisfied. And even if there are setbacks, you can find an antidote. You can find a solution. Whereas for Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, I mean, Nietzsche's an atheist. I mean, I think the religious gap is huge in one sense, in terms of the faith in or the possibility of individuals.
Well, Nietzsche isn't an atheist, right? Atheism in that sense is closer to theism to faith.
Yeah, that's okay.
than what
Okay, right.
exists,
That's right. Okay.
Because what exists in these societies is a sentimental will to believe, a kind of halfway house between faith and the lack of faith. And that's further away from faith than Nietzsche's atheism.
But that's not Emerson and Whitman. They were not.
I'm sure.
That's not Emerson and Whitman. They were, they truly, and Melville too. Melville loved writing. I mean, Melville became frustrated and distraught. I mean, Melville himself was deeply religious, but he was much more of a Catholic.